Hello and welcome to Pitboards and Podiums with me, Maya Westwick. In today's episode, we are going to be talking all about the 2024 Miami Grand Prix, so buckle up and let's talk F1. Alright guys, so as I've just said, today we are going to be doing the race weekend recap for the Miami Grand Prix, and I am very excited because some very exciting things happened and I'm going to talk all about it. And you know, Lando Norris is a race winner now. That's all I'm going to say. So sorry if you didn't watch it, but then why would you be listening to this? So I am going to start from the start of the weekend so that we're not missing things out. But it was a sprint weekend, so same as in Shanghai a couple of weeks ago. That meant that there was only one free practice session, and then we had sprint qualifying, sprint race, qualifying for the main race, and then the race itself. Some information ahead of the weekend. Aston Martin had tried to appeal Fernando Alonso's penalty for the incident he had with Carlos Sainz in China, but the right of review was refused. So that means that Alonso has to keep the penalty and also the penalty points that were put onto his super license. And quite a few teams brought some upgrades to the Miami Grand Prix, but McLaren brought a huge upgrade package with 9 upgrades all at once rather than spreading them out over multiple race weekends. The whole package was brought on Lando's car for Miami, and then half of the package was on Oscar's car, and then from the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix next race weekend, Oscar will also have all of the upgrades. So it was estimated that Piastri was going to be about 0.2 a lap slower than Lando Norris based on pure performance, but both of the McLarens were expecting huge improvements in just all around drivability, speed, all of it. In the first practice session, and only practice session of the weekend, Max Verstappen topped the timesheets, and Leclerc had very limited running because he span at turn 16. Basically, he span just because he didn't have much grip, and then he wasn't able to get the car going again, and it caused a red flag in the session, which of course reduced everybody's running, because his clutch got so hot in the heat of the Florida sun that the clutch burnt out. So he couldn't get into reverse to be able to shuffle the car around and get going again. He just blocked the track off, and he literally got 3 laps of practice. On to sprint qualifying. In SQ1, this was a 12-minute session, and as per the regulations, all of the lap times had to be set on a new set of medium tyres, new set when SQ1 started. Of course, they can do a couple of laps on one set. And SQ1 was topped by Lando Norris with a time of 1 minute 27.939 seconds. Piastri was in P2, 0.117 seconds behind, so that just shows you how impressive these upgrades are that McLaren have brought. And that especially is impressive for Piastri, considering that they were expecting to be 0.2 tenths behind Lando based on pure performance. And Leclerc was the first of the drivers out on track, which is not surprising due to the lack of track action that he had up to that point in the race weekend. Deep into turn 7, he had to catch the car, same place as his accident in qualifying last year. Basically, he was on the paint, the car got loose. He also at some point hit the wall at turn 16, as did about half of the grid at some point during the race weekend. Alonso brushed the wall. He basically hit his right rear tyre relatively hard, didn't really cause any damage or anything, but he did make contact with the wall. And Magnussen complained on his team radio that a Sauber ahead of him was massively in the way in turns 13, 14 and 15. And Piastri had an incident with Valtteri Bottas where he, on his team radio afterwards, said, "If that's not a penalty, then I don't know what is." And Bottas said to his engineer, "That is way too late, man. I had no idea." Basically what had happened is Bottas this weekend had his first weekend with his new race engineer, and his new race engineer did not pre-warn him that Oscar Piastri was approaching behind him on a fast lap, as Valtteri Bottas was going slow, having completed his fast lap. So going into turn 1, Bottas went to go to the apex of the corner slowly, realised at the very last second that Piastri was coming very, very quickly into that space that he was about to go into, and both drivers had to swerve out of the way to avoid an accident. So that was looked at by the stewards afterwards, and a 3-place penalty was given to Valtteri Bottas so that he would start the sprint race 3 places back. And as I'm going to tell you in a moment, that meant he started at the back of the grid. Logan Sargent at his home race in Miami did not have a fabulous sprint qualifying. He qualified Time-wise, he qualified P20 until Alex Albon's lap time was deleted, despite him setting a purple Sector 3, so the fastest Sector 3 time of the entirety of SQ1. He still only qualified in P20 on pace, called himself a dumbass on the radio, and then when Albon's lap time was deleted for cutting the chicane, of course that meant that lap time did not stand because he left the track. That meant that Sargent was bumped up to P19 with Albon in P20, and that is the first time that Sargent has ever outqualified Alex Albon. The lap time that Albon had that was deleted was a 1 minute 29.112, so still not a fabulous lap time, but it wouldn't have put him last, which is where he, in timings, had qualified. And the 5 drivers out in Q1 were Pierre Gasly, 0.145 seconds from the cutoff, Zhou Guanyu, 0.227, Bottas, 0.320, Sargent, 0.511, and then Alex Albon with his lack of time. Of course, Bottas qualifying in P18 meant that he was going to start the sprint race P20. Very interesting to note that with the 2 McLarens topping SQ1, Verstappen was in P4, Perez was only in P9. Meanwhile, the Haas cars, Magnussen was in P5 and Hülkenberg was in P15. So Hülkenberg only just scraped through. On to SQ2. This was a 10-minute session. Again, by the regulations, had to be set on a new set of mediums. So this was once again topped by Lando Norris, this time with a 1 minute 27.597 second lap, which was actually the fastest lap time of the entirety of sprint qualifying. And Piastri in SQ2 found himself in P6, 0.566 seconds behind Lando. Ocon went out of the pits at a very strange angle, and the Alpine mechanics kind of went running out after him to see if he needed help, but he got himself turned around properly, and I'm pretty sure we also saw Pierre Gasly do that later in the race weekend. So there's something about the Alpines that they just were not able to get enough steering lockdown to exit their garages in the pit lane and get into the fast lane of the pits the same way that everyone else has managed to do. So that was a bit odd. Ricciardo hit the wall at turn 16. Hamilton also hit the wall at turn 16. He also had a pit lane infringement noted, which was because his pit crew were not wearing helmets while they were servicing his car. But when that was investigated by the stewards after the session, no further action was taken because it turned out that most of the teams were not adhering to the rules on crew wearing PPE. So of course they can't punish Mercedes and Hamilton without punishing absolutely everybody else. In SQ2, it is also worth noting Perez was P2, Verstappen P4, Leclerc P3 and Sainz P8, and Norris had track dominance over Verstappen in every corner and every straight other than turn 17. There was one tiny segment of the track where Verstappen was faster. Hülkenberg was in P10, and the 5 drivers out of SQ2 were George Russell, 0.013 seconds off of Hülkenberg's time. Lewis Hamilton, 0.041 seconds off. So that just shows you that Mercedes had an absolute shocker of a sprint qualifying. It was a disaster for them. Esteban Ocon was 0.049 seconds off of Hülkenberg. Magnussen was 0.284 seconds off of his teammate. And Tsunoda in P15 was 0.406 seconds off. In SQ3, this was an 8-minute session on soft tyres, and that was topped by Verstappen, so he was on pole for the sprint race with a time of 1 minute 27.641 seconds, which of course is slower than the lap time that Lando Norris set on the medium tyres in SQ2. In the first 3.5 minutes of this 8-minute session, nobody has come out on track, so of course that means that everybody pretty much is going to have one shot at a lap. Norris was not able to find as much excess pace on the soft tyres as he was on the mediums, so he ended up being 0.831 seconds slower than Verstappen's time. He did set his best final sector, but he was almost a second slower on the softs than on the medium tyres, so it was kind of raising questions of maybe the upgrades that McLaren had brought, if they were only really suited for the race, if they were only really suited for pace on harder, more durable tyres, if perhaps the tyres just weren't in the correct working window because he was running wide, sliding around everywhere, didn't really seem to have the temperature and the grip that he needed to have in those tyres. When Verstappen was told that he was the pole sitter, he asked what happened to everybody else. He was like, I mean, I'll take it, but he was quite surprised that he was on pole because he had not had a very good session either. But the majority of the drivers really kind of struggled with their tyres on the soft tyres at Miami, and a lot of people were very much sliding around, bouncing over curbs, having disastrous laps but not having consequences for that necessarily, because everybody else around them was having equally as disastrous a lap. So we had Verstappen on pole, Leclerc P2, Perez P3, Ricciardo P4, which he was very happy with, and he said afterwards that it was nice to silence a few people, but he very quickly was humbled again on Saturday, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Sainz P5, Piastri P6, Stroll P7, Alonso P8, Norris P9, and Hülkenberg P10. Now on to the sprint race itself. Ahead of the race, as the cars were all leaving the pit lane, Ocon and Leclerc were involved in an unsafe release. Ocon broke his front wing because he ran into the side of Leclerc. He literally drove into the side of Charles Leclerc's car. The Ferrari mechanics were frantically checking the car on the grid to make sure that there was no damage. Potentially the right rear tyre looked like it was going to need changing, but nothing much more above that, which of course they were very relieved by, because if he had damaged the diffuser or something like that, that could have been disastrous for them, and Ocon received a 10-second penalty for that. Albon started the sprint race from the pit lane for changing his suspension setup during parc fermé conditions, and Tsunoda and Sargent both started on soft tyres and everyone else was on the mediums. On lap 1, turn 1 of lap 1, Lando Norris is out of the race. It was disastrous, and both of the Aston Martins were also involved in that. So coming up to turn 1, Lando Norris was on the outside, minding his own business down to turn 1. Stroll was going around the outside of Alonso. Lewis Hamilton goes up the inside of Alonso into a gap, locks up. Alonso is being pushed towards Hamilton by Stroll. They've made contact. Hamilton locks up, isn't able to turn the car. He makes contact with Alonso, which pushes Stroll and Alonso out to the outside, which then means that Stroll makes contact with Lando Norris, absolutely punts him off the track, and Lando's race is over from an incident that he had nothing to do with. Zak Brown very much disagreed with the fact that the race stewards decided they didn't need to investigate it and just called it a lap 1 error, and their judgment for it was that it was a lap 1 incident. There was too many individual things to blame one or two drivers wholly for the responsibility of it, so they just didn't give anybody a penalty. But it did very much seem like Alonso and Lando particularly, but Alonso and Lando were kind of the victims in that situation. The safety car came out at the end of lap 1 as a result of that, and during this time Ricciardo managed to get up to P3, Sargent got up to P12, and Russell was down to P14. Alonso went into the pits to change tyres because he had a puncture from that, and he was onto the medium tyres in P18. On lap 2, under the safety car, Stroll retires and Ocon serves his 10-second penalty, because obviously serving that under the safety car means that he's going to lose quite a fair amount less time than he would lose if he served it on a normal green flag racing lap. On lap 3, the safety car ended at the end of the lap, and nothing really happened on the safety car restart. It was pretty chill. On lap 5, DRS was activated and Perez passed Ricciardo for P3. On lap 7, Lando Norris was then noted for walking across the track back into the pits, which was going to be investigated after the race. Very similar to Lewis Hamilton last year, he obviously stood on the outside of the track with his car. He's got the pit lane right across the track from him, so he ran across the track and went into the pits. But he was investigated for that, and he was actually fined €50,000, with 25,000 of that being suspended, with the condition that within the 2024 season he doesn't do the same thing basically, or a similar thing. On lap 8, Hamilton attempts to move on Magnussen, and Magnussen starts what turned into a weekend of extremely aggressive defending. And I will talk about this in a moment, because Kevin Magnussen was moving mad. He truly was moving mad this weekend. On lap 9, Magnussen misses the chicane. So Hamilton reports on his team radio that Magnussen has left the track and gained an advantage there, which obviously drivers are not allowed to do. On lap 10, Verstappen is asked for a balance and degradation update by his race engineer, and he replied, "Terrible, zero rear grip, it's just like qualifying." On lap 11, Hamilton and Magnussen had another incident. So Hamilton tried to get around Magnussen. Magnussen does the switchback, taking the inside line into turn 12. They make contact, but Magnussen stays ahead. He then also gets a 10-second penalty for the prior incident of leaving the track and gaining an advantage. On lap 12, Sainz is trying to get past Ricciardo. He's still behind him, but he's very much been pushing for the last few laps to try and get past. And Hamilton is noted for speeding in the pit lane under the safety car. On lap 14, Magnussen is shown the black and white flag for track limits violations. And also, Hamilton got ahead of Magnussen. Magnussen then pushes both himself and Hamilton off track. Tsunoda comes round, takes advantage of this situation, passes Hamilton as Magnussen and Hamilton re-entered the track, which meant that in effectively one move, Lewis had lost a position after gaining a position. So he'd only net lost one position, but grossly, he'd gained one and then lost two in one move. On lap 15, Hamilton was ahead of Magnussen chasing Tsunoda down. Magnussen received another 10-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. And on lap 19, Hamilton passes Tsunoda for P8, the last lap of the race. Magnussen received another 5-second penalty for track limits. That was because obviously he's already had this black and white flag. And Hamilton received a drive-through penalty for speeding in the pit lane, which was converted to a 20-second post-race penalty. So, the finishing order for the sprint race. Max Verstappen finished in P1 with a race time of 31 minutes, 31.383 seconds. Charles Leclerc was P2 and Perez was P3, completing the sprint podium. We then had Daniel Ricciardo P4, Sainz P5, Piastri P6, Hülkenberg P7, Tsunoda P8, the last of the points places. Hamilton crossed the line in P8, but he did not end up there. He ended up with his 20-second penalty, finishing in P16. Magnussen crossed the line in P10, but with his total of 35 seconds of penalty added to his race time, he was down in P18/last. We then had Gasly, Sargent, Zhou, Russell, Albon, Bottas, Ocon, Hamilton, Alonso, and then Magnussen. Post-race, Magnussen blamed Hülkenberg for breaking DRS and leaving him vulnerable, and basically very candidly said in his interview with Natalie Pinkham that he was doing his bit as a team player to get Hülkenberg his points. He says that his penalties were fully deserved, which Lewis, when he was asked about it, laughed and said that he really respects Kevin for saying that. But because of this honesty, he was then investigated for unsportsmanlike behaviour, which eventually the stewards, after qualifying for the main race later in the day, decided to continue with no further action on that. So Magnussen's total penalties, he received 3 10-second penalties for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, and 1 5-second penalty for track limits. The last of the 3 10-second penalties also came with 3 penalty points, so that took him up to 8 for the 12-month period. Hamilton's, as I said, was a drive-through penalty for speeding in the pit lane, converted to 20 seconds post-race. Norris, as I said, he received a reprimand, which was his first of the season, and a €50,000 fine, 25,000 of which was suspended. And as I said, lap 1, the incident was decided to be no further action needed to be taken. And the official FIA document for that said, "It appeared there were at least 3 collisions that occurred. We were not able to identify one or more drivers wholly or predominantly to blame for the various collisions or any one of them. Also, keeping in mind that this was turn 1 of lap 1, where greater latitude is given to drivers for incidents, we took no further action." Which was, of course, controversial. On to qualifying for the main race. So we're on Saturday afternoon now. Q1 was topped by Max Verstappen with a time of 1 minute 27.689, and we were looking at a 48 degrees Celsius track temperature. It was very, very warm. There was a huge queue in the pit lane, and it seemed that the teams were kind of using the first run as a bit of a test, because everybody was going out on used softs, and some people abandoned their laps halfway through the laps, things like that. But of course, with the sprint rules, that meant that between the sprint race and qualifying, they were able to come out of part thermic conditions, change the setup a little bit. So they were probably just testing to make sure that they were happy with the setup and to work out how to use what they'd got with the car. Zhou was noted for failing to follow the race director's instructions for cutting into the pit lane queue ahead of Daniel Ricciardo, which was going to be investigated after the session. And he did receive a warning for that, not like a reprimand or anything like that, but he did receive a warning. He did also receive a reprimand, which was his first of the season, for a later infringement, which was for crossing the line at the pit exit, and that happened at the end of Q1. Verstappen, on his team radio as he was leaving the pits, said that the clutch was not sounding very good. Sargent claimed that Tsunoda ruined his lap, and with 3 minutes to go, another big queue in the pit lane was forming. Leclerc had a moment where the Williams ahead of him, they weren't directly impeding, they were not physically in his way, but of course the turbulent air that comes off of Formula 1 cars, they were damaging his lap. And he on his team radio said, the Williams they know what they do. I mean, it's far, but they know what they do. Sargent did not manage to get through to Q2 at home, despite setting a purple sector 3 of 24.944 seconds. Bear in mind, Verstappen's best sector 3 was 25.099, so he is a whole tenth and a half faster than Max Verstappen in that sector. And the 5 drivers out in Q1 for qualifying were Valtteri Bottas, Logan Sargent, Daniel Ricciardo, with, of course, his grid penalty from Shanghai. That meant that he was going to start last, Magnussen and Zhou. In Q2 was topped by Charles Leclerc with a time of 1 minute 27.533, despite him not getting any purple sectors on his lap. Verstappen had a purple sector 1 and Perez had sector 2 and 3. Norris grew wings and flew for a second, coming off the curb at the exit of the chicane. Albon at turn 17 brought out the yellow flags. The car wouldn't turn enough because his tyres were absolutely destroyed. He said that he couldn't get them to last more than 6 corners. And he stopped before hitting the wall or anything like that, so he just had to reverse to get going again because there was no chance that he was going to make the corner. Leclerc's time that topped the session bettered Lando Norris's time from the day before, which made it the fastest time of the weekend so far. Norris tried to go out on his second run on the medium tyres to see if that would improve his time, but it didn't. In the pit lane, Leclerc had to slam on the brakes with Aston Martin coming out ahead of him. Basically, he was already coming down the fast lane. The Aston Martin's cut out ahead of him. He had to slam on the brakes. He flinched the steering wheel a little bit, but there wasn't anything really too dramatic from that. Verstappen was P2, 0.033 seconds off of Leclerc's time, and Hamilton 0.164 seconds off of it in P3, and Hülkenberg was P10 with a time of 1 minute 28.2 seconds, so good for him. The drivers out in Q2 were Lance Stroll, 0.022 seconds off of Hülkenberg. He was very, very surprised with the drop from Q1 to Q2. He'd failed to even improve on his Q1 time, and despite a very good effort on his final lap attempt, he was out, unfortunately, qualifying P11 for the race. Gasly was in P12. He was 0.124 seconds off of Hülkenberg, which also this makes it his first time out qualifying Ocon this year. Ocon was P13, 0.171 seconds off, Albon P14, 0.213 seconds off, and Alonso P15, 0.227 seconds off after a very messy lap. He'd missed the apex going into turn 16 and lost time, and it just was not a well put together lap for him in general. On to Q3, which was topped by Max Verstappen with a time of 1 minute 27.241, which was the new fastest time of the weekend. For everyone's first attempts in Q3, they went out on the soft tyres, apart from Norris, who went out on the mediums. Hamilton set a lap time that was 1 second slower than his Q2 time, saying that he had no grip at all. Sainz and Hülkenberg were noted for impeding at turn 17, but there was no further investigation deemed necessary for that, and that was Sainz impeding Hülkenberg. Norris then switched onto the soft tyres for his final lap attempt to try and get something out of them. He was not having a good time, bless him. And then both the Mercedes actually went onto new medium tyres for their final attempts, and everybody else on new soft. And this was because Mercedes had run out of new soft tyres. So to use new tyres at all and try and get some life out of the tyres, they were forced to go onto the mediums. For the final lap attempts, the track temperature was now down to 45.8 degrees rather than 48 degrees as it was earlier. George Russell seemed a bit worried that he wasn't going to make the checkered flag and said on his team radio that they needed to tell Lewis to hurry up because Lewis was ahead of him. He ended up making it by about 1.5 seconds. Verstappen set a purple sector 1, with Perez getting purple sectors 2 and 3 again. And Verstappen's pole time meant that it was his 7th successive pole in Formula 1. And we had Leclerc P2, Sainz P3, Perez P4, Norris P5, which is his highest start in Miami, and also McLaren in general's highest start in Miami. Oscar Piastri in P6, which is the 5th race in a row that he's been on the 3rd row of the grid. George Russell P7, Lewis Hamilton P8, which was the only lap time set on medium tyres that was that driver's fastest lap. Nico Hülkenberg P9 and Yuki Tsunoda P10. Gasly was investigated afterwards for a potential pit lane infringement for basically he joined the fast lane quite slowly because he was not at the right angle, and in the process that allowed Esteban Ocon to get past him. He was investigated for that, but no further action was deemed necessary. And I've already said about Ricciardo starting from the back of the grid due to his penalty from China, and Zhou's warning and reprimand. So, on to the race. Hamilton, Alonso, Magnussen and Ricciardo were all starting on the soft tyres in an attempt to overcut the people around them. Bottas was starting on the soft in an attempt to gain positions on track from the start and then potentially undercut the people around him, and everybody else was on medium tyres. Everybody down to P14 was on mediums other than Lewis Hamilton, and then all the other tyre strategies that I've mentioned are in the bottom 6 of the grid. It's also worth noting that at Miami, the undercut is not very powerful, so it was a risky strategy for Bottas, so he was going to have to really make up positions at the start, which unfortunately he was not able to do. He had a disastrous lap 1 and ended up down in like P19. So on lap 1, Leclerc had a very poor start off of the line, but he was kind of saved by Sergio Perez, and I'm going to tell you why. Perez was also noted for a false start. That was deemed no further investigation necessary. But Perez locked up at turn 1, almost took out Max Verstappen. He was millimetres away from taking Verstappen out, and ended up with Leclerc P2, Piastri P3. Sainz on his radio said that should be a penalty. He nearly took us all out. And the Alpines were scrapping each other very, very hard. They were literally driving two abreast, side by side, down through the chicane, through turn 16, corners that you would not expect to see Formula 1 cars going side by side through. They were going through side by side. They were fighting each other. On lap 2, Hülkenberg passes Hamilton for P7. Gasly passes Alonso for P12, battling around for a little bit and banging wheels. Zhou and Magnussen are having a little battle as well. Zhou had to leave the track and give the place back, and then they started scrapping around again. Zhou got ahead for P17, and then Bottas passes Magnussen for P18, and Russell is back in P10, so he had a poor start to the race as well. On lap 4, Piastri spent a lot of the lap right on Leclerc's gearbox and then passes Leclerc at turn 17 for P2, so he has had an incredible start to the race. On lap 5, Leclerc then tries to come back at Piastri with DRS down the pit straight. Piastri defends beautifully and maintains position, and George Russell passes Yuki Tsunoda for P9. On lap 7, Leclerc is really struggling with his rear grip already. The car's massively sliding around, and Carlos Sainz behind him is hinting at the Ferrari team to swap them around, saying that he has good pace. Hamilton passes Hülkenberg for P7. Hülkenberg's moving around a lot, and Hamilton had to ease off the throttle to prevent an accident. It could have been something quite dramatic had something happened there. It was kind of edge of your seat, but they controlled it because they are good racers, but it was a bit on the edge. Hülkenberg then passes Hamilton back for P7 because Hamilton locked up at turn 17 and Hülkenberg took advantage of that. On lap 8, Piastri is told to manage his battery pack. On lap 10, we've got a DRS train down from Hülkenberg in P7 pretty much consistently all the way down to Ricciardo in P20, and everybody is struggling for grip. The track temperature at this point is 46 degrees Celsius, so that's worth noting, and Hamilton passes Hülkenberg into turn 11 for P7. On lap 11, Albon pits going on to the hard tyres. He comes out in P20, 12 seconds behind Ricciardo in P19. Also on lap 11, Russell attempts to make a move on Hülkenberg, who has been protected by DRS, and Russell is not able to make that move stick. On lap 12, Hülkenberg locks up, which means that he loses DRS on Lewis Hamilton, makes him very vulnerable to George Russell, who then manages to get past him a little bit later on in the lap for P8. Also on lap 12, Stroll, Sargent and Bottas all pit for hard tyres, coming out respectively in P17, 19 and 20. On lap 13, Hülkenberg then pits pretty much straight after Russell got past him at the end of lap 12. Hülkenberg pits onto the hard tyres, coming out in P15 after a 3.2 second stop. Gasly pits onto the hard tyres, coming out in P16 after a 2.5 second stop. Albon breezes past Stroll on the straight, but Stroll then fights back around turn 11. Albon goes off track and comes back on comfortably ahead of Lance Stroll, which means, of course, he needs to give the place back. This was down in P17 and 18, and there was no further action deemed necessary by the stewards for leaving a track and gaining an advantage because he did give that position back. On lap 14, Lando Norris is making moves on Perez, trying to get past him. Also, Leclerc is told to box opposite McLaren. Both drivers stay out. So this was very clearly a dummy attempt by Ferrari because just the whole thing, they sent that radio message after Leclerc had already passed the pit entry, which of course on the telemetry McLaren would have been able to see. They sent their mechanics out into the pit lane very late. It was just a bit of a sloppy attempt at a dummy message. And Verstappen is told to stop managing tyres now to pull away from Piastri, who is still only 3 seconds behind him. On lap 16, Carlos Sainz drops back from Charles Leclerc, which seems to indicate that he is starting to do a bit of tyre management to try and come back at Leclerc later on in the race with fresher tyres, having been able to extend his stint on these tyres. And Leclerc sets the fastest lap of the race so far. So you can kind of see the two Ferrari drivers seem to be on very different strategies. On lap 18, Perez pits going on to the hard tyres. He has a 1.9 second stop coming out in P10, which releases Lando Norris into free air. On lap 19, Lando Norris has a team radio message from Will Joseph, which potentially is one of the deciding factors in that man winning his first race. Will Joseph says to him, "Sainz is the car ahead. We should go after him rather than protect from Perez." Lando says, "Yeah, I agree, let's go get him." And he sets the fastest lap so far with a 1 minute 32.476. On lap 20, Leclerc pits, has a 1.9 second stop going on to the hard tyres coming out in P6. Perez passes Ocon for P9, and Lando sets another fastest lap so far, about 500ths faster than his previous fastest lap. On lap 21, Leclerc passes Hamilton for P5. Hamilton has not pitted yet at this point, bearing in mind that Leclerc has, and this was around the outside of around turn 13, 12, 13, 14, that section of track. And the bollard at the turn 15 chicane, Max Verstappen decides we don't need that here anymore. He hit the bollard and punted it off, and it basically got carried on his car. So he said on his team radio to check the front wing, because of course he's gone into something solid with the front wing. But he's then carried the bollard around with him to the exit of turn 16, where it's finally fallen off the car and bounced pretty much onto the racing line of the track. This does move. It blows about in the wind and blows off of the racing line, but of course it could also blow back onto the racing line very, very easily. Norris sets another fastest lap, and then Leclerc beats it with another fastest lap, and then on lap 23 we get a virtual safety car, because lots and lots of drivers on their team radios have been complaining about the bollard, particularly those who have not pitted yet. When the virtual safety car was brought out, it was not at an opportune moment for Lando Norris at all, unfortunately for him. He was the other side of the track. Only 3 drivers actually managed to take advantage of it, because it ended before the end of the lap as well. It was very, very short, and those 3 drivers were Ocon, Alonso and Magnussen. Ocon went onto the hard tyres coming out in P14, and Alonso and Magnussen went onto the mediums coming out in P15 and 19 respectively. On lap 24, DRS is re-enabled and Verstappen pits from the lead. He goes onto hard tyres coming out in P4 with a 2.2 second stop. So we've now got Piastri P1, Sainz P2, Norris P3, and they also adjusted his front wing because of course he hit something with it. So with the new tyres, they just adjusted it, checked the aero was all good, and they did it very, very quickly. Alonso makes a move down the inside of Gasly at turn 17 for P14. Ocon is starting to chase Hülkenberg down. Lando Norris sets another fastest lap of the race so far, and Leclerc is told we need to push a bit more. He then responds, "The race is long, guys. This tyre feels good." He's basically saying, don't tell me to burn this tyre up, because this tyre still has life in it. The race is long. It's a marathon, not a sprint. On lap 25, Ocon passes Hülkenberg for P12. Russell pits going on to the hard tyres, coming out in P12, coming out between Ocon and Hülkenberg, so Ocon has gained another place with that. And there's now 5 seconds between Piastri in P1 and Norris in P3, and then another 10 seconds back to Verstappen in P4. On lap 26, Alonso passes Hülkenberg for P13, Perez passes Tsunoda for P16. Hamilton says on his team radio that it is now impossible to see the curb of the chicane because the massive bollard that was sticking up into the air that was the visual point for all of the drivers to refer to is no longer there, and Russell passes Ocon for P11. On lap 27, Hamilton pits onto the medium tyres coming out in P9 after a 2.4 second stop. On lap 28, Piastri pits onto the hards coming out in P4, Sainz pits onto the hards coming out in P5, and Lando Norris is now leading the race with Max Verstappen P2, Charles Leclerc P3, and what a sight to see. This was the start of history being made. Gasly passes Hülkenberg for P14. Verstappen complains of some very low grip, saying he locked up his tyres, and we get a yellow flag at turn 2 because Magnussen and Sargent have had an incident. So this brings out the safety car from lap 29. Basically, Magnussen and Sargent had been battling from the pit straight through turns 2 and 3. Sargent didn't see Magnussen. His rear right and Magnussen's front left made contact because Magnussen tried to stick his car somewhere that really he shouldn't have. Yes, there was a gap there, but it was not somewhere that is like a typical overtaking place. And it was also not somewhere that Sargent would be thinking to look in his mirror and check there wasn't a car there. They make contact. Sargent gets punted off backwards into the wall. That's the end of his home race. Potentially his last ever home race. According to some rumours, his last ever race, but Williams have refuted those. And Magnussen receives a 10-second penalty for causing a collision. He is still in the race, but right at the back, and Sargent is out. He can go home now. So, not good for him. Under the safety car on lap 29, Perez pits, taking advantage of the cheaper pit stop, coming out in P6 on the mediums. Tsunoda pits, coming out in P7 on the hards. Zhou pits, coming out on the soft tyres in P14. Far too early to be going on to the softs if you're going to try and make those last to the end of the race. Ricciardo coming out in P15 on the mediums, Hülkenberg P17 on the mediums, and Stroll P18 on the mediums. Lap 30, Lando Norris then pits onto the hard tyres from P1. He comes out in P1 as well, and he has a 2.1 second stop. But because he's gone into the pits, the safety car hasn't picked him up, because of course when the safety car has gone to try and pick up the leader of the race, Lando Norris was not on the racetrack. So the safety car's got Verstappen, it's got P2, but it's not got the leader of the race, which means that Lando Norris, if they didn't let the rest of the cars pass the safety car to come back round and then pick up Lando would have been able to get the entire way around the track and end up a whole lap ahead of everybody else. So something went wrong there for them, for the race directors, because it took them a minute. It took them a good few seconds for them to go, oh yeah, Max isn't actually leading this race, is he? So Norris was almost 30 seconds ahead by the time that the others are let past. He was 25 seconds ahead of Verstappen when he came out of the pits, but yeah, by the time that the others were let past, almost 30 seconds ahead of Verstappen. And then, of course, the safety car picks up Lando. Lando is driving extremely slowly compared to everybody else. Everybody bunches up behind him. Everything is good. Bottas pits, going on to the medium tyres, coming out in P18. The rest of the field, as I said, once they're past the area of the incident, once they're past that first segment of the track, they then go past the safety car, go around, complete the lap, and come up behind Lando Norris. Magnussen also pits, going on to the medium tyres, and he comes out in P19, which is now last. 22 seconds behind Bottas in P18 because, of course, he's had to crawl back around the track. On lap 32, by this point, the majority of the pack is, as I've said, caught up. It's pretty much only Magnussen that isn't, and Verstappen is less than 1 second behind Norris. So he, of course, they don't have DRS under a safety car because they're not racing under a safety car, but he is within DRS range. Magnussen is given his penalty for the incident for causing a collision after he's already pitted onto the medium tyres. So on this lap, he pits once again to serve the penalty, coming out on medium tyres, and he is then noted for an infringement for entering the pits and not changing tyres. But I believe he did change tyres, he just changed onto the same compound. I believe. That has slipped my mind, I can't lie to you. The safety car ends at the end of lap 32, which was an incredibly stressful time for anybody who was a Lando fan. Lap 33. Norris is still in the lead from the safety car restart. Verstappen drops back and is now under pressure from Leclerc, and Norris is setting a new fastest lap of the race so far with a 1:31.157. On lap 34, DRS is enabled. Hülkenberg passes Ricciardo for P15. Piastri holds on against Sainz. Sainz claims that he's pushed off track and says, tell him to give me the position and doesn't get a penalty, and he is just going off on his team radio, just keeps going on about it. It's investigated for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, but turns out Piastri didn't even leave the track, so of course no further investigation. To which Sainz says, "Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible. They won't give him a penalty." No. It seems like Carlos has a problem with Oscar. I think he's jealous, personally, because he's with Lando now, not Carlos. Sad times. On lap 34 as well, Hamilton gets past Tsunoda for P7. Then on lap 36, Sainz tries to pass Piastri at turn 11 and fails. Norris is almost now 2 seconds ahead of P2 and sets another fastest lap so far with a 1:31.133. On lap 38, Sainz is told on his team radio, 20 laps to go, stay focused, you've got this. He replies, "Leave me alone. I don't want to talk to you," basically. On lap 39, Verstappen is complaining that he can't get the car to turn. He says that it's a disaster. On lap 40, Sainz forces his way past Piastri. Piastri had to literally slam on the brakes to stop that being a race-ending crash. Piastri passes back, locks up, goes off track, then has to concede the position for this battle for P4 because of him going off track, which is incredibly unfortunate for him. Magnussen is noted for failing to serve his penalty incorrectly at this point, which is what I've mentioned, and Piastri is then passed by both Perez and Hamilton in one go because he's got front wing damage from the contact with Carlos Sainz, which is noted by race control. So he needs to now box to replace the front wing, which completely ruins his race. On lap 41, Piastri does box for this new front wing. He has a 10.7 second stop on 2 medium tyres coming out in P19, and Norris sets another fastest lap of the race with a 1:31.059. Carlos Sainz says on his team radio something is wrong with the car. We don't hear anything else about that. Hamilton says, "If you've got any more power, give it to me." And then Piastri sets the fastest lap of the race so far with a 1:30.643. On lap 45, Stroll passes Ricciardo for P15. On lap 46, Ocon passes Alonso for P9. On lap 47, Piastri passes Magnussen for P18. So he is starting to work his way back up, but he's not really got enough time to do any significant damage with that. On lap 48, Alonso tries to pass Ocon into turn 1, but Ocon maintains position. Stroll passes Zhou for P14, and Alonso then uses DRS ahead of turn 12 to get past Ocon for P9. On lap 49, Piastri passes Bottas for P17. It is announced that the Sainz-Piastri incident will be looked at after the race, and Carlos Sainz did actually receive a penalty for that. He received a 5-second penalty, which did demote him down 1 position. On lap 51, Piastri had a battle with Ricciardo, locked up, had to concede position, and also then on his team radio he is told, "Oscar, just a reminder that Lando is currently leading the race. We don't want to cause a safety car. Basically, don't be doing that, please. Don't bring out a safety car right now. It's not good for us." On lap 52, Stroll goes off track in a battle with Albon at turn 1. He can't give the place back because Zhou passes Albon very, very fast afterwards. So if he was to try and give the place back to Albon, he'd also lose a position to Zhou. So we've now got Stroll P13, Zhou P14, Albon P15. He is noted for leaving the track and gaining advantage and investigated after the race, and he receives a penalty for doing so. On lap 53, Albon is now down to P19. He has a massive lock-up straight off into the runoff area, turns around, carries on, pits at the end of the lap onto soft tyres, but of course he is down at the bottom. There's no coming back from that. On lap 55, Norris is now almost 7 seconds into the lead over Max Verstappen. Piastri passes Ricciardo for P15. On lap 56, Norris is 7.5 seconds ahead of Verstappen. And on lap 57, Lando Norris wins his first ever Formula 1 Grand Prix. How exciting. He also won Driver of the Day with 41% of the vote. And in his 110th race and 16th podium in his F1 career, he became a race winner for the first, very certainly not the last time. He is now just 2 points behind Carlos Sainz in the Drivers' Championship in P5, Carlos in P4. He's 51 points behind Verstappen in P1. He is the 21st British driver to win a Formula 1 race and the 114th race winner in Formula 1. And he won his first ever race with a race time of 1 hour, 30 minutes and 49.876 seconds. We had Max Verstappen at 2.612 seconds behind in P2, Charles Leclerc competing the podium 9.92 seconds behind, Carlos Sainz in P4, but that got demoted down to P5 with his 5-second penalty, which pushed Perez up to P4, Hamilton P6, which is his first top 6 Grand Prix finish of 2024, Tsunoda P7, Russell P8, Alonso P9 and Ocon P10, which is the first point that Alpine have managed to secure so far this season. We had Hülkenberg P11, Gasly P12, Piastri P13 with the fastest lap of the race, which was his 1 minute 30.634 seconds on lap 43. Of course, he didn't get a point for that because he wasn't in the top 10, but he did get the fastest lap. Zhou P14, Ricciardo P15, Bottas P16, Stroll P17, Magnussen P18, Albon P19, and Logan Sargent, who did not finish the race, completing 27 laps of the race. Stroll got a 10-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, which is why he's down in P17, and as I said, Carlos Sainz got a 5-second penalty for causing a collision, which I'm a little bit confused about because the standard new penalty for causing a collision is 10 seconds, so why did he only get 5? But I'm not a race steward. So here we are. But yeah, after a very, very exciting weekend, after a tumultuous weekend, lots of ups and downs, Lando Norris is officially a race winner in Formula 1. I think that's very exciting and very well deserved. And I had a fabulous time. I cried. I was happy. It was beautiful. So yeah, thank you for recapping an incredible race weekend with me. And I will see you very soon with the track guide for Imola. Very exciting. We've got the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix coming up, which also historically, very good track for Lando. So potentially, you know, he's very good around Imola. He enjoys Imola. McLaren's upgrades could be very good around Imola. Is McLaren now faster than Red Bull? Who knows? We'll see. But I think it's a fabulous time to be a McLaren girl. So, exciting. If you did enjoy this episode, please do let me know. Like, rate, comment, subscribe. I would really, really appreciate it. I'd love it if you could share the podcast as well. It would mean the absolute world to me. If you want to join me over on the Pitboards and Podiums TikTok, please do. I am posting every single day in May. And I'm absolutely loving it. And it's great to be able to talk to people and, you know, discuss things about Formula 1 and just share things and build a little community. And I'm having a fabulous time over there. So please do come and join me if that feels like something that you would want to do and take part in. And I will see you very, very soon with another episode. And that's everything from me. Miami. Who would have thought? Yeah. Bye.